All right, what's up, everyone? I'm going to be talking about Chalmers' conceivability argument for dualism, his argument against materialism, and Anthony Brueckner's response to it. So, just a very simple version of Chalmers' argument, starting with one, physicalism. So, physicalism is the idea that everything existing is physical, including consciousness. And so if physicalism is correct, any possible world with the same physical facts as our actual world will include everything that exists in our world which is physical, including consciousness. A possible world where all of the same physical facts about our world are present and consciousness is absent is conceivable and is therefore possible. So from 2 and 3, 1 would be false by modus tollens. This is kind of a simplified version of Chalmers' argument, but I think it should be sufficient for what we're getting at. So in other words, we can conceive of a physical duplicate of our world without consciousness, and therefore such a duplicate is possible, whereas physicalism states that such a world is impossible. Let the conception of consciousness be the C concept, and the concept of being physical in the ways that human bodies actually are be the P concept. And then we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but just keep that in mind. So just for some clarification, Chalmers is using these words conceivability and possibility in a technical sense. When he's talking about possibility, he's not talking about nomological possibility or physical possibility. Chalmers, I think, would agree that if you have the physical conditions for consciousness, then you would have consciousness. He's just talking about logical and metaphysical possibility. And when it comes to conceivability, he's not talking about anything like unrestricted imagination. He's talking about ideal conceivability, which has a lot of criterions and things that are requisite for it. This is much more like what the medieval philosophers were referring to when they talked about conceivability. One good way to think about this that I've heard is imagine you had garbage ankles, right? So every time you played basketball, or every time you went on a hike, every time you did sports, you're just constantly spraining your ankles and you're constantly in and out of the hospital because of it. Let's say a scientist comes to you and says that they're going to make a duplicate of your ankles for you, but they're not going to be garbage ankles, right? He's going to make the duplicate, but they're not going to have their garbaginous features. Chalmers, under this idea of conceivability, would say that you can't actually conceive of that. Like, that's not actually conceivable. Because if you're making a molecule by molecule duplication of your ankles, all of the features that were there that made your ankles garbaginous to begin with are going to be there in the duplicate. So trying to conceive of garbage ankles, or trying to conceive of this duplicate that gets rid of the garbaginous properties of your ankles would be like trying to conceive of a 5-sided triangle, for example. So Chalmers uses this idea of philosophical zombies. Amy Kind describes philosophical zombies as a creature that is microphysically identical to a human being, and thus produces behavior that is indistinguishable from that of a normal human being, but lacks any sort of consciousness in the phenomenal sense. So a philosophical zombie could be me talking to you right now. Someone who has the brain states and behaviors of a human being, but does not actually have the phenomenological with side of being. So to break down Chalmers' argument with the conception of P-zombies, what Chalmers wants to say is that P-zombies are conceivable and they're therefore possible. So he's arguing that it is metaphysically possible for brains and brain states to exist without consciousness, and therefore consciousness is an additional layer to the metaphysical makeup of reality. It's additional to the physical. So the argument is, since P-zombies are conceivable, they are possible. and therefore consciousness is something separate and additional to the physical. Therefore, physicalism is false. Brueckner wants to make a point about the standard objection to this argument, and the standard objection is kind of this, along the lines of this prima facie intuition that we have, that conceivability it's not sufficient for possibility. Just because you can conceive of something doesn't mean it's possible. And what Brueckner wants to do, he's not going to offer that objection, but he wants to talk about the way that Chalmers reacts to that objection. And he wants to talk about why he thinks it has problems. So the standard objection is that conceiving the truth of phi is not sufficient to establish the possibility of phi. So just take an example. You might think that it's conceivable that in some possible world you find a substance that is water-like. It seems like water in every aspect, but its chemical structure is not H2O. That might be conceivable, but many philosophers would argue that it's impossible that water is anything other than H2O. They would argue, like anyone who would take Kripkean semantics would argue that it is necessary that water is H2O. And the reason for this is because the semantic view is that the word water is something that's formed by coming to this substance in our perceptual apparatus, and it's kind of, I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but it's kind of an ostensive use of a word, right? If I say water, I'm saying that type of thing that fills our lakes and our rivers and our oceans, and it doesn't matter if I understand that as H2O. That's the fact that that's H2O is just a metaphysically necessary fact about the substance I'm talking about. So that's just an example of why it might be conceivable, why something might be conceivable, but that doesn't mean it's possible. So to get into Chalmers' response, we kind of have to talk about his two-dimensional approach to semantics. So what Chalmers thinks that we're doing is we're failing to disambiguate between two different dimensions of semantics. We have to distinguish between primary intentions and secondary intentions. So the primary intention is a word sense. So this is like the primary intention is like water is the watery stuff. So it could be H2O. It could be some substance XYZ that's all watery in a possible world, but isn't actually H2O. To quote Brueckner from this article, a concept's primary intention determines a property possessed by all and only the objects found in the various extensions in the range of the function that is the primary intention. So the secondary intention is kind of what we were talking about before. This is like the word really in the Kripkean sense. This is like a rigid intention. Water refers rigidly to the stuff out there that we come to meet through perception. And so water is H2O. It can't be anything else. So